Little girl teaches millionaire CEO a lesson, her wisdom left him completely paralyzed. What would you do if a single moment of distraction cost you everything you thought you knew about reality? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from, enjoy the story. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Seattle, tech billionaire Dominic Reeves was about to discover that some accidents change more than just your insurance premiums. His custom Bentley Mulsanne, worth more than most people's houses, cut through the downtown streets like a midnight predator. The titanium bracelet on his wrist caught streetlight reflections as he checked his phone for the 17th time in 10 minutes. His company's autonomous vehicle program had consumed 3 years and $2.3 billion only to crash against an impossible computational wall that his MIT and Stanford graduates couldn't solve. "Sir, the weather advisory suggests taking the main route tonight," his driver Marcus had warned earlier. "I'll handle this myself," Dominic had replied, dismissing the man who'd worked for him faithfully for 8 years. "Go home to your family." Now, alone behind the wheel, Dominic's mind raced through quarterly projections while his dashboard displayed the very traffic algorithms that refused to cooperate. His amber-green eyes, enhanced by precisely crafted contact lenses, reflected the screen's glow as another urgent message from Tokyo demanded his attention. The elementary school zone appeared through the rain like a trap. Speed limit signs blurred past, barely visible through sheets of water cascading across his windshield. For exactly 2.7 seconds, as investigators would later determine with mechanical precision, Dominic's eyes left the road. Have you ever experienced that terrible moment when time stretches like elastic, when you realize something catastrophic is about to happen and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it? The small figure materialized from darkness, a tiny shadow against the harsh streetlight. Dominic's racing reflexes, honed by years of competitive driving, engaged instantly. The Bentley's advanced braking system screamed against wet pavement, but physics doesn't negotiate with wealth or desperation. The impact felt softer than expected, like hitting a large bird rather than a child. Steam rose from the crumpled hood as the car lurched to a complete stop. For one eternal moment, Dominic sat frozen behind the wheel, his left eyelid beginning its telltale twitch, the only outward sign that his legendary self-control was fracturing. What he found when he stumbled from his vehicle would challenge everything he believed about intelligence, coincidence, and the impossible connections that bind human lives together across time and space. Stay with me, because what this 7-year-old girl knew about his deepest secrets would leave a billionaire completely paralyzed with shock. Phoenix Adler had been walking home from her after-school math club when 4,000 pounds of German engineering changed her life forever. She flew exactly 12 feet through the rain-soaked air, landing with what paramedics would later describe as impossible grace for someone her age. When Dominic reached her, expecting tears and hysteria, he discovered something that made his blood turn to ice water. Phoenix sat upright in the downpour, methodically examining the scrape on her arm with the detached curiosity of a research scientist studying an interesting specimen. "Are you hurt?" Dominic's voice cracked. The first time in 15 years that his composure had failed him in front of a stranger. Phoenix looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too ancient for her small face. She didn't blink once during the entire conversation that followed, her chestnut hair plastered against her skull by the relentless rain. "Statistically speaking, I should be dead," she stated with matter-of-fact precision, her voice carrying an odd mixture of childlike cadence and graduate-level vocabulary. "A 4,200-pound vehicle traveling at 28 miles per hour has a 95% fatality rate for pedestrians my size. The probability of my survival with minimal injury calculates to roughly 0.0847%. Dominic stared at her as his mind struggled to process what he was hearing. "How do you possibly know the exact weight of my car?" "Bentley Mulsanne, 2023 model with optional reinforced chassis package." The computational pattern becomes quite obvious once you account for manufacturer specifications and optional equipment loads. Phoenix stood up, casually brushing dirt from her yellow sock. Her right foot, Dominic noticed with growing bewilderment, wore a purple sock decorated with green stripes. "You weren't paying attention to the road for approximately 2.7 seconds, she continued, gesturing toward the skid marks with the authority of a traffic accident investigator. "I calculated the trajectory from the tire friction patterns and deceleration rate. Do you know someone who could perform complex mathematical calculations immediately after being struck by a car?" Because what happened next defied every assumption about childhood trauma and shock response. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by police cars and, inevitably, the media vultures. Dominic watched in mounting horror as news vans materialized from the rain like carrion birds sensing fresh disaster. By the time Phoenix was loaded into the ambulance, after she insisted on calculating the optimal route to the hospital and arguing with EMTs about their choice of roads, his phone was buzzing with calls from his crisis management team. "Sir, we have a major situation developing." Victoria Nash, his head of communications, appeared at his elbow within 20 minutes of the accident. Child pedestrian accidents involving billionaires trend on social media within hours. "We need to control this narrative immediately." The calculation was brutally simple: one carefully orchestrated photo opportunity versus months of devastating publicity that could destroy his company's upcoming IPO. Like this video if you've ever made a decision that seemed logical but led to consequences you never could have imagined. Seattle Children's Hospital smelled like industrial antiseptic and crushed dreams. Dominic arrived the next morning with his entire media relations team, carrying a teddy bear that cost more than most people's monthly salary and wearing an expression carefully calibrated to convey appropriate concern for the cameras. Phoenix's room was located on the third floor, overlooking a courtyard where parents paced while their children fought battles that medicine couldn't always win. As they approached, Dominic could hear her voice through the door, not crying or complaining as expected, but humming a strange mathematical melody that seemed oddly familiar yet impossible to place. "Remember, we need at least 3 minutes of usable footage," Victoria whispered urgently. "Ask her how she's feeling, maybe read her a story. Keep everything simple and age-appropriate, she's just a child after all." Dominic pushed open the door and immediately stopped dead in his tracks. Phoenix sat propped up in her hospital bed, her leg encased in a cast that extended from ankle to knee. But instead of watching cartoons or playing with age-appropriate toys, she was using a black marker to cover every available inch of white plaster with mathematical equations so complex they seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. "What exactly are you doing?" Dominic asked, his media-trained voice carrying just the right note of gentle adult concern. Phoenix didn't look up from her work, her small fingers moving with surgical precision as she created symbols and numerical relationships that seemed to flow across the cast like living organisms. Designing a more efficient traffic flow algorithm to prevent accidents like ours from recurring in urban environments. Dominic laughed, a sound that emerged more condescending than he'd intended. "That's very creative, sweetheart, but traffic management systems are incredibly complicated. Perhaps you should focus on healing and getting better." For the first time since entering the room, Phoenix looked directly at him. She maintained unblinking eye contact for exactly 37 seconds of complete silence. "Your autonomous vehicle program has been stalled for 3 years because your neural networks cannot process real-time environmental variables while maintaining computational efficiency," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "The fundamental problem isn't with your machine learning algorithms, it's with your basic approach to predictive modeling." The expensive teddy bear slipped from Dominic's hands and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Behind him, he could hear his camera crew shifting uncomfortably, their equipment suddenly feeling intrusive and inappropriate. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Phoenix pointed to a dense section of equations covering her cast, her finger tracing patterns that actually hurt Dominic's eyes to follow. "You're attempting to use linear regression models to predict fundamentally nonlinear behavioral patterns. Human drivers don't make rational decisions, they make emotional ones influenced by stress, fatigue, personal relationships, and subconscious biases. Your vehicles are trying to predict rational behavior within an inherently irrational system. Have you ever had a moment when everything you thought you knew about the world suddenly felt like a house of cards in a hurricane?" Dominic's mind reeled as he recognized the exact computational problem that had consumed his company's brightest minds for 3 years. The solution that had eluded teams of PhD mathematicians and computer scientists with decades of combined experience. Comment below, what would you do if a 7-year-old solved your company's biggest problem in 5 minutes? That night, Dominic sat in his penthouse office staring at photographs of Phoenix's equations while his world quietly collapsed around him. His head of AI development, Dr. Rebecca Torres, had spent 4 hours analyzing the images his team managed to capture before hospital security politely asked them to leave. "This is mathematically impossible," she reported over a secure video conference, her usually composed voice carrying notes of genuine bewilderment. "These equations represent a level of theoretical sophistication that shouldn't exist outside of advanced doctoral programs. But more disturbing than their complexity, they're absolutely correct." Child prodigies exist throughout history, Dominic replied, his fingers unconsciously touching the titanium bracelet on his wrist. Mozart composed symphonies at 5 years old. Mozart didn't invent entirely new forms of mathematical notation, Dr. Torres countered sharply. Some of these symbols don't appear in any published academic literature. It's as if she's developed her own mathematical language that somehow bridges quantum mechanics with traffic engineering. Dominic ordered a complete background investigation on Phoenix Adler and her family. What his private investigator discovered was disturbingly ordinary: a middle-class household in suburban Seattle, parents employed as a nurse and high school teacher, no family history of exceptional academic achievement. Phoenix's school records showed good grades, but nothing that would indicate the mathematical genius Dominic had witnessed. There's something else you need to know, Marcus Chin, his private investigator, reported 3 days later during a confidential meeting. The girl's birth records show some unusual timing coincidences that are statistically remarkable. What kind of coincidences? Phoenix Adler was born exactly 7 years ago on March 15 at 11:47 p.m. That's the precise time and date that Professor Edmund Blackwood died. Dominic's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. Professor Blackwood had been his mentor at Stanford, the brilliant mathematician who had guided his early research into computational theory and artificial intelligence. More than that, Blackwood had been working on the exact same traffic optimization algorithms that Phoenix had somehow solved. That has to be a coincidence, Dominic said, though his voice lacked any conviction. Perhaps, Marcus replied carefully. But there's additional information that complicates that explanation. Professor Blackwood's final research notes, the ones sealed by the university after his death, contain mathematical notation that's identical to what the girl drew on her cast. We're talking about symbols and theoretical frameworks that were never published, never shared with colleagues, never released to academic journals. The implications hit Dominic like a freight train carrying impossible cargo. If Phoenix somehow had access to Blackwood's unpublished research, then either she was part of an elaborate conspiracy that made no logical sense, or something was happening that challenged every rational assumption about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human knowledge itself. I want her medical records, Dominic said quietly. All of them. Brain scans, blood work, everything the hospital collected after the accident. What Marcus discovered in those medical files would force Dominic to confront possibilities that his logical mind refused to accept, but that the evidence was making increasingly difficult to deny. Share this video if you believe some coincidences are too perfect to be accidents. Against every instinct screaming at him to maintain distance from this impossible child, Dominic found himself returning to Phoenix's hospital room 3 days later. This time, he came alone, without cameras or media handlers or corporate strategies designed to manage public perception. Phoenix was sitting by the window, no longer drawing equations but gazing out at Seattle's skyline with an expression that seemed impossibly ancient for someone who should be worried about homework and playground politics. "You came back," she observed without turning around, her voice carrying neither surprise nor satisfaction. Just simple acknowledgement of a fact. "Your equations," Dominic began, then stopped. "How do you ask a 7-year-old if she's somehow channeling the intellectual legacy of your dead mentor? They're quite remarkable for someone your age." "They're just patterns," Phoenix replied with a slight shrug. "Everything becomes patterns if you understand how to look properly." Dominic settled into the chair beside her bed, studying her profile against the afternoon light streaming through the window. Her freckles seemed to shift and dance across her nose, creating new constellations with each subtle movement of her head. "Would you like to visit my company?" he asked impulsively, surprising himself with the invitation. "When you're feeling better, of course. We have some interesting projects that someone with your mathematical abilities might find engaging." Phoenix turned to look directly at him, and for one heart-stopping moment, Dominic could have sworn he glimpsed something hauntingly familiar in her unblinking stare. A depth of accumulated knowledge that reminded him of countless late nights in Professor Blackwood's laboratory working through theoretical problems until dawn painted the sky. "I would like that very much," she said simply. The words themselves were ordinary, but something in her tone carried weight that seemed disproportionate to her age. It was as if she understood implications and possibilities that extended far beyond a simple corporate tour for an intellectually gifted child. "Phoenix," Dominic said carefully, "when you look at those traffic patterns you drew, do you remember learning about them somewhere? From a book or a teacher, or maybe something you saw online?" "I don't remember learning," she replied thoughtfully. It's more like remembering something I always knew but had forgotten. Like when you wake up from a dream and for just a moment you can almost recall something important, but then it slips away before you can hold onto it properly. Her explanation made absolutely no logical sense, yet it resonated with something deep in Dominic's consciousness, a recognition that felt both impossible and inevitable. As he prepared to leave, Phoenix spoke once more without looking away from the window. The person who taught you to see patterns in mathematics, eh? He would be proud of what you've accomplished, but sad about what you've forgotten. Dominic's hand froze on the door handle. He had never mentioned Professor Blackwood to Phoenix, never spoken about his mentor to anyone at the hospital. Subscribe now, because what Phoenix reveals during her visit to his company will challenge everything you think you know about life, death, and the connections that bind us together. 2 weeks later, Phoenix stood in the middle of Dominic's corporate headquarters, her mismatched socks, yellow and purple today, creating a splash of color against the sterile gray marble floors. She had insisted on using crutches instead of a wheelchair, and she moved through the building with that distinctive hop-skip cadence that somehow seemed more graceful than the purposeful strides of the executives around her. "This is our main development floor," Dominic explained, leading her through a maze of cubicles where his programmers worked on various projects. "We have teams working on everything from social media algorithms to autonomous vehicles." Phoenix stopped in front of a massive wall-mounted display showing traffic patterns from around the world. The data flowed in real time, creating a mesmerizing dance of lights and numbers that represented millions of vehicles moving through global transportation networks. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of wonder that reminded Dominic she was still just a child. "Like watching the heartbeat of the world." "Most people find it overwhelming," Dominic said. "Too much information to process." "Most people aren't looking for the right patterns," Phoenix replied. She approached the display, her unblinking eyes tracking the data streams with impossible focus. "There, do you see it?" Dominic followed her gaze but saw only the chaotic flow of traffic data. "See what?" "The rhythm. It's not random, it's musical. Like a song being played on 1,000 instruments at once." Phoenix began humming that same mathematical tune Dominic had heard in her hospital room, and impossibly, the traffic patterns seemed to synchronize with her melody. "Phoenix, how do you? Why did you build a company that helps people connect but never visit your own mother at the nursing home?" The question hit Dominic like a physical blow. Around them, the constant hum of corporate activity seemed to fade into silence. His executive team, who had been following at a respectful distance, stopped walking. Dr. Torres, who had been explaining the technical specifications of their latest servers, stood frozen with her mouth half open. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Dominic's voice was barely a whisper. Phoenix turned to face him, her ancient eyes boring into his soul. "Your mother, Margaret Reeves, resident of Sunset Manor Care Facility, room 247, admitted under the name Margaret Blackwood to protect your privacy. You haven't visited her in 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The world seemed to tilt around Dominic. His left eyelid began its familiar twitch, and his hand moved involuntarily to the titanium bracelet on his wrist. "How do you know that name?" "What name?" Phoenix asked innocently. "Blackwood. You said she was admitted under the name Margaret Blackwood." "Did I?" Phoenix's expression was genuinely confused. But Dominic's entire executive team had heard it. Dr. Torres's face had gone pale, and Victoria Nash was frantically taking notes on her tablet. The name Blackwood wasn't publicly connected to Dominic in any way. It was the surname of his mentor, the man who had died the moment Phoenix was born. "I need to see the security footage," Dominic demanded, his southern accent bleeding through his carefully controlled voice as he addressed his head of security. They were in his private conference room, the blinds drawn against the Seattle skyline. Phoenix had been taken to the company cafeteria by Dr. Torres, leaving Dominic alone with his rapidly mounting paranoia. "Sir, I've reviewed every second of footage from the past 2 weeks," Marcus Fletcher, his security chief, reported. "The girl never left her hospital bed during the time frame when she supposedly researched your personal information. More than that, she had no internet access, no phone, no visitors except for her parents and medical staff." "Then how does she know about my mother? About the nursing home?" "That's not the strangest part," Marcus continued. "I pulled the admission records from Sunset Manor. Your mother was indeed admitted under the name Margaret Blackwood, but that information is sealed under multiple privacy orders. There are exactly 4 people who know that name is connected to your family: you, your mother, your lawyer, and me. Dominic's mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Industrial espionage? Impossible, the information wasn't digital. A con game? No 7-year-old could maintain such an elaborate deception, which left only one explanation that his rational mind refused to accept. "Sir, there's something else," Marcus said quietly. "I took the liberty of pulling the girls' medical records from the hospital. The brain scans they ran after the accident show some unusual activity patterns." "What kind of unusual?" The neurologists couldn't explain it. "Portions of her brain are showing activity patterns that don't match any known baseline for children her age. In fact, they don't match any known baseline at all." A chill ran down Dominic's spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean the activity patterns are unique, like nothing they've seen before. But when I had a friend at the medical examiner's office compare them to historical data." Marcus paused, clearly struggling with what he was about to say. "They're identical to brain scans taken from Professor Edmund Blackwood during his final medical exam 3 days before he died." The titanium bracelet on Dominic's wrist suddenly felt ice-cold against his skin. Professor Blackwood, his mentor, his guide through the complexities of computational theory. The man who had believed in him when no one else would. The man who had died at exactly 11:47 p.m. on March 15th, 7 years ago. The same moment Phoenix had been born. "Get me everything," Dominic whispered. "Every medical record, every brain scan, every piece of data we can legally obtain. I need to understand what's happening here." But even as he spoke the words, Dominic knew that understanding might be the most dangerous thing he could pursue. When Dominic returned to the cafeteria, he found Phoenix sitting alone at a corner table, methodically arranging French fries into geometric patterns while humming her mathematical tune. The sight of her, so small and ordinary yet impossibly connected to mysteries that defied explanation, filled him with a mixture of wonder and terror. "Phoenix," he said, sitting down across from her. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked up from her French fry patterns, her unblinking stare fixing on his face. "Truth is subjective, Mr. Reeves. What seems true to you might not be true to me. Do you know who Professor Edmund Blackwood was?" Phoenix's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped moving. For exactly 17 seconds, Dominic counted, she remained perfectly still. "I don't know that name," she said finally. "But you told my staff that my mother was admitted under the name Margaret Blackwood." "I don't remember saying that." "Phoenix, I'm not angry. I'm not going to hurt you. But somehow you know things that you shouldn't be able to know. Things that were private, secret. I need to understand how." Phoenix resumed arranging her French fries, creating a pattern that Dominic realized looked remarkably like the traffic flow algorithms she had drawn on her cast. "Sometimes I know things," she said quietly. "Like when I look at the numbers on your wall, I can see the patterns that other people miss. Or when I look at you, I can see the sadness you carry around your mother. But how do you see it? The same way you see colors or hear sounds. It's just there." Phoenix glanced up at him. "You loved him very much." "Loved who?" "The man who taught you to see patterns. The one who died when I was born." Dominic's breath caught in his throat. "I never told you when he died." "You didn't have to," Phoenix said. "I can see it in the way you look at me. Like you're seeing a ghost." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood. Around them, the corporate cafeteria buzzed with normal conversation, employees discussing quarterly reports and weekend plans, completely unaware that reality itself was being questioned at table 12. "Are you scared of me?" Phoenix asked, her voice carrying the vulnerability that reminded Dominic she was still just a child, regardless of what impossible knowledge she possessed. "I'm scared of what you represent," Dominic admitted. "I've built my entire life on logic, on provable facts. You're asking me to believe in things that shouldn't exist." Phoenix nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. Sometimes the most important things can't be proven. They can only be felt. That night, Dominic drove through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle to Sunset Manor, a journey he hadn't made in over 3 years. The nursing home was a testament to efficiency over comfort, clean, sterile, and utterly depressing. His mother's room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a courtyard where residents in wheelchairs sat staring at nothing. Margaret Reeves looked smaller than he remembered, her once vibrant red hair now silver-white and thin. She was sleeping when he entered, her breathing shallow but steady. At 83, she had been battling dementia for 5 years, and on her good days she sometimes remembered having a son. "Hello, Mother," Dominic whispered, settling into the chair beside her bed. She stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment, They were clear and focused, and Dominic felt a surge of hope. "Edmund?" she said softly. "Is that you?" The name hit him like a physical blow. "No, Mother. It's Dominic. Your son." Margaret's eyes clouded with confusion. "Dominic? Who is Dominic?" "I'm your son, Mother. You remember you worked 3 jobs to put me through college. You believed in me when no one else did." "I never had children," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Edmund always said we would have children someday, but then he died and I never found anyone else." Dominic's world tilted. His mother had never married Edmund Blackwood. She had never even met him. Blackwood had been Dominic's mentor, not his father. Yet somehow in her dementia-addled mind she had created a false memory of a relationship that never existed. "Mother, Edmund Blackwood was my professor at Stanford. You never knew him." "Don't be silly," Margaret said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with confused children. "Edmund and I were going to be married in the spring. He had such wonderful ideas about mathematics and computers. He said he was going to change the world." The titanium bracelet on Dominic's wrist seemed to burn against his skin. Inside it were the ashes of his father, a man who had died when Dominic was 12, a construction worker who had never met Edmund Blackwood or heard of Stanford University. But here was his mother, lost in the fog of dementia, speaking about Edmund Blackwood as if he had been the love of her life. As if she had known him intimately, loved him deeply, planned a future with him that death had stolen away. "Tell me about Edmund," Dominic said quietly, his scientific mind desperate to understand this impossible connection. Margaret's face lit up with the first genuine smile he had seen from her in years. "Oh, he was brilliant. So brilliant it sometimes frightened me. He could see patterns in everything, in music, in mathematics, in the way people moved through crowds. He said the world was like a giant equation, and if you could just find the right formula, you could solve any problem." These were Edmund Blackwood's exact words, phrases Dominic had heard 100 times during late-night sessions in the Stanford laboratory. But his mother had never been to Stanford, had never met his professor, had no way of knowing these intimate details of a man she had never encountered. Unless something impossible was happening. Unless the boundaries between minds, between lives, between past and present were far more fluid than anyone had ever imagined. The next morning, Dominic sat in his office with Phoenix's complete medical files spread across his desk. The brain scans were unlike anything he had ever seen, patterns of activity that defied medical explanation, neural pathways that seemed to form impossible connections. Dr. Rebecca Torres sat across from him, her expression troubled. "I've consulted with neurologists at 3 major hospitals," she said. "They all agree that these scans show activity patterns that shouldn't exist in a living brain." "What do you mean, shouldn't exist?" "The neural pathways shown in these scans require decades of specialized learning to develop. They're the kind of patterns you see in the brains of mathematical savants, expert programmers, people who have devoted their entire lives to computational theory. But this child is 7 years old." Dominic studied the scans, comparing them to the historical data from Professor Blackwood's medical records. The similarities were undeniable, not just similar, but identical in ways that defied coincidence. "There's something else," Dr. Torres continued. "I've been analyzing the equations Phoenix drew on her cast. They're not just solutions to our traffic flow problems, they're solutions to problems that Professor Blackwood was working on when he died. Problems that were never published, never shared with anyone. How is that possible? I don't know. But I've found references to similar symbols in Blackwood's private research notes, equations that he was developing for a completely different application. Phoenix somehow knew not just the solutions but the entire theoretical framework that led to those solutions." Dominic leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built a billion-dollar empire on logic and provable facts, screamed that this was impossible. But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, terrifying in its implications. "What if she's not just coincidentally brilliant?" he asked quietly. "What if she's somehow connected to him?" "You mean like reincarnation?" Dr. Torres's scientific mind clearly rebelled against the suggestion. "Dominic, you're talking about supernatural phenomena. There's no scientific basis for." "Then explain the brain scans. Explain how she knows things that were never published. Explain how a 7-year-old girl can solve problems that have stumped teams of PhD scientists." Dr. Torres had no answer. But as Dominic stared at the impossible data spread across his desk, one thought kept returning to haunt him: if consciousness could somehow transfer from one person to another, if knowledge and memory could survive death, then everything humanity believed about life and death was wrong. And Phoenix Adler, a 7-year-old girl with mismatched socks and an unblinking stare, was living proof that the impossible was not only possible but sitting in his company cafeteria, arranging French fries into geometric patterns while humming mathematical melodies that belonged to a dead man. 3 days after the corporate revelation, Dominic made a decision that would either prove his sanity or destroy it completely. He arranged for Phoenix to visit the most classified section of his empire. A subterranean research facility buried 5 stories beneath downtown Seattle where his team worked on projects that governments would kill to access. The facility required 7 different biometric scans just to reach the elevator. Phoenix descended into this technological fortress wearing her signature mismatched socks, today bright orange and deep purple, her small frame dwarfed by the massive steel corridors that stretched endlessly in every direction. "This is where we develop our most advanced research," Dominic explained, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Artificial intelligence systems that can predict human behavior, quantum processors that solve problems in seconds rather than decades." Phoenix moved through the underground complex with disturbing familiarity, her eyes scanning the various laboratories and testing chambers like she was reviewing old memories rather than experiencing something new. She paused at intersections, choosing directions without hesitation, leading Dominic deeper into sections of his own facility that he rarely visited. "The quantum lab is this way," she said, pointing down a corridor that Dominic knew led to their most secure research area. "How do you know that?" "The electromagnetic signatures are different. Quantum processors generate specific frequency patterns that feel familiar." They reached the heart of the facility, a massive chamber housing workstations that had been sealed since Professor Blackwood's death 7 years earlier. These weren't just any computers. They were prototype quantum systems that Blackwood had been developing for traffic optimization research that was decades ahead of its time. Phoenix approached one particular workstation, her small hand reaching toward a biometric scanner that glowed red with security warnings. The system had been programmed to accept only one person's biological signature, a person who had been dead for 7 years. "Phoenix, don't touch that. The security systems will She placed her palm against the scanner. The machine flashed green. Every security protocol in the building should have triggered. Alarms should have screamed. Armed guards should have flooded the chamber. Instead, the workstation hummed to life with a gentle chime, displaying welcome messages addressed to Professor E. Blackwood. Dr. Torres, who had been monitoring from the observation deck, spoke through the intercom with a voice that trembled with scientific impossibility. "Dominic, that scanner analyzes over 200 different biological markers. Fingerprints, palm geometry, vein patterns, even cellular electrical signatures. It's not just checking identity, it's reading the person's entire biological blueprint." Phoenix was already working at the keyboard, her fingers moving across complex programming interfaces with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades mastering these systems. Code flowed across multiple screens, equations that made Dr. Torres's most advanced algorithms look like elementary arithmetic. "He never finished the Urban Consciousness Project," Phoenix murmured, her voice carrying an adult's frustration with incomplete work. "The traffic patterns were just the beginning. He was trying to create a living city, one that could adapt, learn, evolve like a biological organism." On the screens, mathematical frameworks began emerging that redefined everything Dominic thought he knew about urban planning. These weren't just traffic algorithms. They were blueprints for cities that could think, infrastructure that could anticipate problems before they occurred, transportation networks that functioned like neural pathways in a massive brain. "This is impossible, Dr. Torres whispered through the intercom. "These calculations require understanding of quantum mechanics, advanced neuroscience, and architectural engineering simultaneously. No single person could master all these fields." Phoenix continued typing, her ancient eyes reflecting the screen's glow. "Cities aren't machines to be controlled," she said, her voice now carrying Professor Blackwood's characteristic professorial tone. "They're living systems that need to be understood, respected, partnered with. You can't force efficiency, you have to create harmony." The workstation began executing programs that had been dormant for 7 years, running simulations that would revolutionize how humanity understood urban development. Traffic accidents dropped by 89% in the virtual models. Commute times decreased by 67%. Energy consumption fell by 43%. But more importantly, the simulated cities showed something that no algorithm had ever achieved. They became places where humans actually wanted to live. Phoenix, Dominic said quietly, are you still Phoenix, or are you someone else? She turned to face him, her small face carrying depths of knowledge and sadness that no child should possess. I'm both, she said simply. I'm the person I was meant to become, and I'm the person who needed to finish what he started. Sometimes the most important work requires more than one lifetime to complete. The implications crashed over Dominic like a tidal wave. If consciousness could transfer between bodies, if knowledge could survive death, then everything humanity believed about existence was fundamentally wrong. But more than that, if this was possible, what did it mean? For his mother, trapped in her failing mind? What did it mean for everyone who had ever lost someone they loved? Why me? Dominic asked. Why did this happen to me? Phoenix saved her work and stepped away from the computer. Because you forgot what Professor Blackwood tried to teach you. That intelligence without compassion is just sophisticated selfishness. That connection isn't about data transfer rates, it's about showing up for the people who need you. She walked over to where Dominic stood, her mismatched socks bright against the sterile laboratory floor. Your mother is alone in that facility, and every day you don't visit is another day she spends wondering why the world forgot her. The most advanced algorithm in the world can't solve loneliness. Only presence can do that. The underground facility felt different after Phoenix's revelation, less like a technological fortress and more like a tomb where Dominic had buried his humanity. As they rode the elevator back to the surface, Phoenix sat quietly in the corner, her small form casting long shadows in the fluorescent lighting. The traffic algorithms are complete now, she said as the elevator climbed toward street level. Your company will save thousands of lives with improved urban planning. Stock prices will rise. Investors will celebrate. But none of that matters if you don't understand the real lesson. Dominic studied her reflection in the polished steel walls. What is the real lesson? That you built a company dedicated to helping people connect. But you haven't spoken to your own mother in over 3 years. You've created systems that can predict human behavior, but you can't predict whether Margaret Reeves will remember your name tomorrow. The elevator doors opened onto the main corporate floor, where hundreds of employees worked on projects designed to improve human communication. The irony wasn't lost on Dominic. He had revolutionized how. She has dementia, Phoenix. Sometimes she doesn't even recognize me. Recognition isn't the same as connection, Phoenix replied, her voice carrying wisdom that seemed borrowed from someone much older. Love doesn't require memory. It just requires presence. Your mother may not remember you, but she can still feel whether someone cares enough to sit with her. They walked through the corporate headquarters, past displays showing global connectivity statistics and social media engagement metrics. Dominic had built an empire on the promise of bringing people together, yet he had used that same technology to distance himself from the most important relationship in his life. Professor Blackwood spent his final years working on problems that would benefit humanity, Phoenix continued. But he died alone in his laboratory, surrounded by equations instead of people. He understood every pattern except the most important one, that knowledge without love is just sophisticated isolation. They reached Dominic's office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, millions of people living their lives in buildings that Dominic's algorithms had helped optimize. Yet he felt more disconnected than ever. You want to know why I can access Professor Blackwood's memories? Phoenix asked, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. It's not because of some supernatural phenomenon. It's because unfinished business has a way of finding completion even across lifetimes. What kind of unfinished business? He regretted not teaching his students that intelligence is meaningless without emotional connection. He regretted not spending more time with people who mattered. He regretted not understanding that the most important algorithms calculate compassion, not efficiency. Phoenix pulled out a piece of paper and began drawing, her small fingers creating patterns that looked like mathematical equations but felt like something deeper. Your mother worked 3 jobs to pay for your education. She believed in your potential when no one else did. She sacrificed her own dreams so you could build yours. That's not just family history, that's a debt that can't be calculated in quarterly reports. The drawing she was creating showed interconnected circles, each representing a person with lines connecting them in complex patterns. At the center was a single circle labeled Margaret, with dozens of connections radiating outward, connections that had been severed by time, distance, and Dominic's own fear of confronting his mother's condition. The most sophisticated network in the world is the one that connects hearts, Phoenix said, holding up her drawing. Your company has mastered digital connections, but you've forgotten the analog ones. Your mother is the original network node in your life, and she's been offline for 3 years. Dominic stared at the drawing, seeing his own isolation reflected in the mathematical patterns. What if it's too late? What if she's too far gone to understand that I care? Understanding and feeling are different things, Phoenix replied. She may not remember your name, but she'll remember that someone chose to be present, that someone decided she was worth showing up for. That evening, Dominic drove through Seattle's rain-soaked streets towards Sunset Manor, carrying a photo album that had been gathering dust in his penthouse for 3 years. The facility looked different than he remembered. Smaller, more fragile, like a place where people went to wait for endings rather than beginnings. Margaret Reeves sat by the window in her room, staring out at a courtyard where other residents moved through their daily routines like ghosts performing familiar rituals. At 83, she had shrunk into herself, her once vibrant presence reduced to a whisper of the woman who had raised him. "Hello, Mother," Dominic said, settling into the chair beside her bed. She turned toward him slowly, her eyes struggling to focus. For a moment, they were clear and present, and Dominic felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would remember him. "I know you," she said softly. "You're the boy who used to build computers in the garage." The recognition hit him like a physical blow. She did remember. Not everything, not consistently, but enough to know that he belonged in her story. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your son." "My son," she repeated as if testing the words. "I remember now. You were such a serious child, always working on impossible problems. You reminded me of someone I used to know, a mathematician who believed that numbers could change the world." Dominic opened the photo album showing her pictures from his childhood. Her face lit up with fragments of recognition as she saw images of birthday parties, school graduations, family vacations that had been relegated to forgotten storage in her failing mind. "Tell me about this one," she said, pointing to a photograph of 10-year-old Dominic proudly displaying a science fair project. "You helped me build that," Dominic explained. "It was a traffic simulation program. You stayed up all night helping me debug the code even though you didn't understand programming." "I understood that it mattered to you," Margaret said, her voice carrying echoes of the mother who had sacrificed everything for his dreams. "I always understood that." They spent the next 3 hours going through photographs, Margaret's memory flickering in and out like a faulty connection. Sometimes she called him by his father's name, sometimes she forgot who he was entirely, but she never forgot that he was someone important to her. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked as visiting hours ended. "Yes," Dominic promised. "I'll come back tomorrow." "Good," Margaret said, settling back into her pillows. "I may not remember you visited, but I'll remember that someone cared enough to try." As Dominic prepared to leave, his mother's eyes opened one final time. "You know," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, "I had a dream once about a little girl who could solve impossible problems. She told me that love doesn't require memory, it just requires presence." Dominic's blood ran cold. His mother had never met Phoenix, had never been told about the accident or the mathematical prodigy who had changed his life. Yet somehow, in the failing networks of her deteriorating mind, she had accessed the same wisdom that had transformed his understanding of what truly mattered. Some connections, he realized, transcended rational explanation. 6 months after the underground revelation, Dominic's life had become unrecognizable to the man who had once lived for quarterly reports and stock prices. His company had released the most revolutionary urban planning software in human history, algorithms that were already being implemented in cities across 6 continents. Traffic accidents had decreased by 73% in test markets. Commute times had been reduced by an average of 22 minutes per day. The technology represented billions of dollars in potential revenue. None of that mattered to Dominic anymore. He visited his mother every single day, sometimes finding her lucid and conversational, other times sitting quietly while she slept. He had moved her to a private facility with gardens and music therapy where staff members treated residents like family rather than patients. The cost was enormous, but Dominic had learned that some investments couldn't be measured in financial returns. Phoenix had returned to what passed for normal life, attending regular elementary school, playing with friends, and only occasionally demonstrating the impossible knowledge that had revolutionized Dominic's understanding of reality. Her parents, still bewildered by their daughter's brief brush with corporate fame, were grateful that the media attention had faded. But Phoenix and Dominic continued to meet once a week, usually at the Seattle Science Museum, where they would walk through exhibits discussing mathematics, philosophy, and the strange forces that connected people across impossible distances. "Do you still remember?" Dominic asked her one afternoon as they stood before a display about neural networks and artificial intelligence. "Remember what?" Phoenix replied, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity of a typical 9-year-old. "The equations. The knowledge. The things you knew about Professor Blackwood." Phoenix was quiet for a long moment, her mismatched socks, today yellow and red, bright against the museum's polished floors. "I remember the feeling," she said finally. "Like having a conversation with someone who was very wise and very sad. But the specific things, they're becoming foggy. Does that frighten you?" "No," Phoenix said, taking his hand with the casual affection of a child who had adopted him as an honorary uncle. "I think it means I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be instead of who I used to be." They continued through the museum, past displays that explained the cutting-edge technology Dominic's company had developed. Other visitors recognized him occasionally, whispering about the billionaire CEO who had revolutionized urban planning, but most people simply saw a man spending time with a child who clearly adored him. "Mr. Dominic," Phoenix said as they reached the astronomy exhibit, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy now?" The question caught him off guard. Happiness wasn't something he had considered relevant to his life for years. Success, achievement, market dominance, these were the metrics he had used to measure his existence. But happiness? "I think so," he said honestly. "I'm different than I was before. Better, maybe." "Good," Phoenix said, pointing to a display showing the connection between distant stars. "Because the most important algorithms don't calculate profit margins. They calculate whether you're becoming the person you're meant to be." As they left the museum, Dominic received a text message from the care facility. His mother was having one of her clear days and was asking for him specifically. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't hesitate. He canceled his afternoon meetings, ignored the urgent emails flooding his phone, and drove straight to Sunset Manor. Margaret was sitting in the garden when he arrived, feeding birds with breadcrumbs saved from her lunch. She looked up as he approached, her eyes bright with recognition. "There's my boy," she said, patting the bench beside her. "I was just thinking about you." Dominic sat down next to her, watching sparrows fight over crumbs. "What were you thinking about?" "How proud I am of the man you've become. Not because of your success, but because you learned to choose people over profits. That's the only algorithm that really matters." 2 years after the accident that had changed everything, Dominic stood before his company's board of directors and announced his retirement from daily operations. At 47, he was stepping away from the empire he had built to focus on what he called more meaningful calculations, the complex algorithms required to be a present son, an engaged mentor, and a human being genuinely connected to his community. The Blackwood Foundation, which he had established in honor of his former professor, now supported young mathematical prodigies and funded research into consciousness and memory. Phoenix, now 11 years old and displaying the normal genius of a gifted child rather than supernatural phenomena, served as the Foundation's youngest advisor. Margaret Reeves lived another 18 months after their reconciliation, her dementia progressing slowly but steadily. In her final weeks, she rarely recognized Dominic's face, but she always seemed content when he was present. On the day she died, Phoenix was with him, holding his hand as they sat beside her hospital bed. "She's going somewhere beautiful," Phoenix said quietly as Margaret's breathing slowed and finally stopped. "I can feel it." "How do you know?" "Because that's what happens when love is stronger than forgetting," Phoenix replied. "The important connections don't really end, they just change form." After the funeral, while sorting through his mother's belongings, Dominic found a letter she had written during one of her lucid periods. It was addressed to him in an envelope marked, "For my son, who taught me that brilliance means nothing without compassion." Inside, written in her careful handwriting, was a single sentence: "Thank you for showing me that love doesn't require memory, it just requires presence." Below that, in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, was a mathematical equation, one that Dominic recognized as the solution to Professor Blackwood's final, unsolved problem. But his mother had never studied advanced mathematics, and Phoenix had never been alone with her. The letter concluded with a simple formula written in Margaret's hand: "Love plus presence equals meaning." Some mysteries, Dominic realized, were meant to remain unsolved. They were like the patterns Phoenix had once seen in traffic data, beautiful, complex, and ultimately beyond human comprehension. What mattered wasn't understanding every connection, but recognizing that everything was connected through invisible threads that bound hearts across time, space, and even death. Years later, when people asked Dominic about the accident that had changed his life, he would tell them about a 7-year-old girl who had taught him that the most sophisticated algorithms couldn't calculate the value of showing up. That presence was more powerful than productivity. That love was the only network that truly mattered. Phoenix, now a successful mathematician working on problems that would benefit humanity, would sometimes visit the memorial garden Dominic had created in his mother's honor. She would sit quietly among the flowers, no longer remembering the impossible knowledge she had once possessed, but carrying within her the most important lesson of all, that some connections transcend understanding. And the deepest wisdom often comes from the smallest teachers. The final equation was simple enough for anyone to solve. When love multiplies presence, the result is always meaning.